In 1935, the Rural Electrification Administration began a quiet campaign to bring power lines to American farms, and within 2 decades, nearly every off-grid practice that Depression-era families had relied on for survival was classified, zoned against, or simply buried under a wave of utility contracts that made self-sufficiency look like poverty. What your great-grandparents knew how to do without a single bill in the mail, the utility companies had a very strong interest in making sure you forgot. These weren't primitive people fumbling in the dark. They were resourceful, sharp, and deeply skilled. They kept food cold without refrigerators, generated light without wires, managed water without municipal systems, and fed families of 8 on a quarter acre. 25 of those tricks are still viable today, and most people have never heard of a single one. Before we get into it, hit subscribe. This channel exists to drag these skills back into the daylight. Number 1. The root cellar ice system. Before mechanical refrigeration became standard in rural homes, which didn't happen for most American farm families until the late 1940s, families packed their root cellars with ice cut from ponds in January and February, layered between 18 inches of sawdust or straw. That insulation kept ice solid well into August. A properly packed cellar maintained temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit through the summer. The technique disappeared not because it stopped working, but because GE and Westinghouse spent heavily lobbying for rural electrification subsidies that effectively made ice harvesting economically pointless. You can still build a root cellar. Zoning laws vary, but in most rural counties it requires nothing more than a permit. Number 2. Drip irrigation from clay pots. Called alas, a practice brought to the American Southwest by Spanish settlers in the 1600s and widely adopted by Depression homesteaders. Unglazed clay pots were buried to their necks near plant roots and filled with water weekly. The porous clay allowed water to seep slowly into the soil at exactly the depth root systems needed. Water use dropped by up to 70% compared to surface watering. The practice was never banned. It was simply never taught again once municipal water systems and plastic hose manufacturers entered the market in the 1950s. Number 3. Wood ash lye soap. Your great-grandmother didn't buy soap. She made it from 2 things that cost nothing: wood ash and rendered animal fat. Hardwood ash was packed into a barrel with a hole at the bottom, rainwater was poured through it, and the liquid that dripped out, lye, was collected and combined with lard over heat. The saponification process took about an hour of stirring. The resulting soap was used for laundry, dishes, and bathing. The FDA began regulating soap labeling in the 1930s, and by the 1960s, commercial soap advertising had successfully rebranded homemade soap as unsanitary. It is completely legal to make today. Number 4. Passive solar heating through window placement. Before any insulation code existed, Depression-era builders oriented houses so that the longest wall faced south, with large windows capturing winter sunlight. Interior walls were painted white or light yellow to bounce heat deeper into the room. A well-oriented house could stay 10 to 15 degrees warmer than an identical, poorly oriented one with no additional fuel. This knowledge was systematically ignored during the post-war housing boom, when tract housing was built for speed and profit, not solar efficiency. Modern building codes in many states now actually require specific orientations, though rarely the ones that maximize passive gain. Number 5. Haybox cooking. A pot of stew or beans was brought to a rolling boil for 15 minutes, then placed inside a wooden box lined with tightly packed hay, blankets, or newspaper. The insulation retained enough heat to finish cooking the food over the next 4 to 6 hours without any additional fuel. Families cooking for large groups during the Depression used this method to stretch a single morning fire through an entire day's meals. It works. Fuel costs nothing. No regulation has ever touched it. It simply vanished from cookbooks when gas ranges became affordable. Number 6. Gravity-fed spring water systems. Families living near a hillside spring ran ceramic or wooden pipe, later galvanized steel, downhill to a holding tank, using nothing but gravity to maintain water pressure. A spring located just 30 feet above a homestead could provide consistent pressure comparable to a low-pressure municipal line. The Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, while well-intentioned, created regulatory frameworks that effectively discouraged private spring development in many states by requiring testing protocols that cost more than most rural families could afford. Private spring rights still exist in most Western states. Know your property's water law before you dig. Here's where something needs to be said plainly. The disappearance of these skills wasn't accidental. It was in many cases the predictable result of industries that profit from your dependence lobbying governments to make independence difficult or expensive. That's not a theory. It's documented in the legislative histories of the Rural Electrification Act, the Federal Housing Administration guidelines, and the Pure Food and Drug lobbying records. The goal of this video isn't to make you angry, it's to make you capable. Number 7. Rendering animal fat for fuel. Lard and tallow were used in oil lamps well into the early 20th century. A simple wick of twisted cotton set in a shallow dish of rendered fat produced steady light for hours. Tallow candles burned cleaner than early paraffin alternatives. Paraffin, a petroleum byproduct, was aggressively marketed starting in the 1880s as cleaner and more modern. It wasn't necessarily cleaner, it was cheaper to produce at industrial scale and generated far more consistent profit. Number 8. Companion planting as pest control. The Three Sisters system used by indigenous communities and adopted by homesteaders planted corn, beans, and squash together in a tight circle. The corn provided a trellis for beans, the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, and the broad squash leaves shaded the ground to prevent weed growth and retain moisture. Pest intrusion dropped significantly because the pesticide industry, which grew explosively after World War II repurposed its chemical manufacturing capacity, had no financial interest in teaching people to farm without chemicals. Number 9. Hand-dug wells with clay seals. Before drilling rigs were common, families dug wells by hand, typically 3 to 4 feet in diameter, and lined them with fitted stone or brick. A clay seal packed around the top 18 inches of the well casing prevented surface runoff from contaminating the water table below. These wells were reliable, maintainable without equipment, and lasted generations. Most counties now require licensed well contractors and specific casing materials, making hand-dug wells illegal in the majority of states. Understand this: the regulation protects water quality, but it also ensures you write a check to a licensed contractor. Number 10. Smoke preservation of meat. Cold smoking, using smoldering hardwood chips held below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, drew moisture from pork, beef, and venison while depositing antimicrobial compounds from the smoke itself. A side of pork cold smoked for 3 to 5 days could hang in a cool cellar for months without spoiling. The USDA's meat processing regulations beginning in the 1960s effectively required commercial-scale operations to follow time-temperature rules designed for large facilities, rules that made small-scale traditional smoking legally ambiguous for anything sold commercially. For personal use on your own land, it remains entirely legal. Number 11. Earthen plaster walls. Interior and exterior walls were coated with a mix of clay subsoil, chopped straw, and sand, called daub or adobe plaster depending on the region. This plaster regulated interior humidity, naturally absorbing moisture when the air was wet and releasing it when conditions dried. Modern drywall does none of this. The shift happened between 1945 and 1960 as the gypsum board industry captured the post-war construction boom, with faster installation times and heavy contractor incentives. Beneath many Depression-era farmhouses sat a brick or stone cistern that collected rainwater from the roof via gutters. Water was drawn up by a hand pump in the kitchen. These systems stored thousands of gallons and required no external infrastructure. Rainwater collection is now regulated in at least 9 states, with Colorado only fully legalizing residential collection in 2016, after decades during which collecting rain that fell on your own roof was technically illegal due to downstream water rights law. Number 13. Solar food drying on framed screens. Simple wooden frames stretched with cheesecloth or fine wire mesh, set on a slight angle facing south, dried sliced fruits and vegetables in 2 to 4 days of summer sun. No electricity, no fuel, just physics. Your grandmother likely had several of these leaned against the south side of the barn. The food dehydrator industry, which exploded in the 1970s, successfully marketed electric drying as more sanitary, despite no evidence that solar drying produced inferior results when done correctly. Number 14. Beeswax wood finishing. Raw beeswax rubbed into furniture and tool handles sealed the wood against moisture, prevented cracking, and was entirely food safe. A single hive produced enough wax annually to maintain a household's worth of wooden implements. The modern varnish and polyurethane industry, which emerged in the 1930s, replaced beeswax finishing by marketing synthetic coatings as more durable, which, in terms of pure scratch resistance, they are. But beeswax is renewable, non-toxic, and repairable. Synthetic finishes are none of those things. Let's pause here for a moment. There's a pattern running through every single one of these skills. None of them required a utility. None of them required a subscription. None of them sent a monthly bill. The people who understood them were, in a very specific and measurable way, free. Not free in an abstract political sense. Free in the sense that a drought or a layoff or a price spike didn't threaten their lives. That kind of freedom made them very difficult to profit from. Draw your own conclusions about why the education system never taught their children what they knew. Number 15. Charcoal production from scrap wood. Small-scale charcoal kilns, essentially a tight stack of wood covered with earth, or clay with a single air hole, converted scrap branches into dense fuel that burned hotter and cleaner than raw wood. This charcoal was used for cooking, smithing, and heating. The process takes roughly 8 hours and produces fuel that can be stored indefinitely. No regulation prohibits private charcoal making for personal use in most states, though open burning restrictions in certain counties apply to the burning phase. Number 16. Herbal wound poultices. Plantain leaves, the common lawnweed, not the banana, were chewed or mashed and applied directly to cuts, insect stings, and minor infections. The plant contains aucubin and allantoin, compounds with documented antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. This was standard household first aid through the 1930s. The FDA's regulatory framework for medical claims, established more rigorously after 1938, made it legally complicated to teach this as medicine, even when the underlying chemistry is valid. Number 17. Stone fruit vinegar from peach and plum scraps. Cores, peels, and pits from summer fruit were packed into a crock with water and a small amount of sugar, covered with cloth, and left in a warm spot for 6 to 8 weeks. The natural wild yeast on the fruit skins converted sugars to alcohol, then to acetic acid, vinegar. It cost nothing. It produced a useful food preservative and cleaning agent. Commercial vinegar producers lobbied for labeling standards in the 1950s that, while technically about consumer protection, effectively made selling homemade vinegar without laboratory pH certification impossible. Number 18. Window box cooling with wet burlap. Before window air conditioning, families hung wet burlap across open windows on the south and west sides of the house. As dry summer air passed through the wet fabric, evaporative cooling dropped room temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees. This works best in low humidity climates, the Great Plains and Southwest. It requires nothing except burlap and water. The window air conditioner, introduced commercially in 1939 by Frigidaire, replaced this technique by making passive cooling seem crude. Electricity bills followed. Number 19. Chicken tractors for soil preparation. Portable bottomless wooden pens, typically 4 feet by 8 feet, were moved daily across garden beds. Chickens scratched, ate pests and weed seeds, and deposited nitrogen-rich manure directly into the soil. This prepared new garden ground in 2 to 3 weeks without tilling equipment. The practice is still legal on most residential properties, though urban chicken ordinances in hundreds of American cities restrict flock size or eliminate chickens entirely, driven largely by neighbor complaints and, in some cases, lobbying by commercial egg producers. Number 20. Nettle tea as a spring tonic. Stinging nettles, harvested with gloves in April and May before they flower, were simmered for 10 minutes, which neutralizes the sting, and drunk as a tea. The plant is extraordinarily high in iron, magnesium, and vitamin C. Families coming out of long winters used it to address the fatigue and deficiency symptoms we now recognize as early-stage nutritional depletion. The supplement industry, which boomed in the 1980s, sells bottled nettle extract for significant sums. The plant grows wild across 45 of the 50 states and costs nothing to harvest. Number 21. Kerosene lamp wicks from cattail fiber. Cattail heads, harvested in late summer, were dried and their fluffy seed fibers, twisted into thick wicks for oil lamps. The fiber burned slowly and cleanly. Families living near wetlands had an essentially limitless supply of lamp material that cost no money. The commercial kerosene lamp industry, dominated by companies like Standard Oil's lamp division, actively promoted branded wicks as superior throughout the early 20th century. The homemade version worked just as well. Number 22. Cob building for summer kitchens. Cob, a mix of subsoil clay, sand, and straw mixed by foot, was used to build summer kitchen structures separate from the main house. Cooking in summer was done outside to keep the house cool. The cob walls, dried to a hardness comparable to soft brick, were waterproof when finished with a lime wash, and required no fired brick, no concrete, and no purchased materials beyond the straw. Modern building codes in nearly every U.S. jurisdiction require permitted structures to meet material standards that effectively prohibit earthen construction, regardless of its proven durability in dry climates. Number 23. Seed saving with dry fermentation. Tomato seeds were saved by scooping the pulp into a jar of water, leaving it for 2 to 3 days until a mold layer formed on top, then rinsing the clean seeds and drying them on newspaper. This fermentation process broke down the germination-inhibiting gel coating on each seed and also killed certain seed-borne diseases. The Seed-Saving Exchange, founded in 1975, documented that commercial hybrid seed sales, which began dominating American markets in the 1940s, were specifically designed not to produce true-to-type offspring, making purchased seeds annually necessary. Your great-grandmother's seeds grew back every year. Number 24. Pine pitch waterproofing for boots and tools. Pine pitch collected from wounds in pine trees, heated just until liquid, and mixed with a small amount of rendered fat, was brushed onto leather boots, wooden tool handles, and seams on canvas tarps. It dried into a flexible, waterproof seal that lasted a full season. Neat's foot oil, made from cattle shin bones, served a similar purpose for leather. Commercial waterproofing sprays, introduced in the 1950s using synthetic polymers, replaced these methods not because they were more effective, but because they were faster to apply and could be sold in a can. Number 25. Willow bark fever reduction. Strips of bark from white willow Salix alba were simmered in water and drunk as a tea when fever struck. The active compound salicin is chemically converted by the body into salicylic acid, the same compound that Bayer synthesized and patented as aspirin in 1899. Aspirin made Bayer one of the most profitable pharmaceutical companies in the world. The willow tree continued growing along creek banks across North America, giving away the same medicine for free. The FDA's prescription and OTC drug framework doesn't prohibit you from drinking willow bark tea. It just doesn't tell you that you can. Every single one of these 25 tricks shares the same core quality. They required skill instead of spending. They made the person who practiced them less dependent on a company, a utility, or a system that could fail, raise prices, or simply decide they no longer wanted to serve you. Your great-grandparents didn't see themselves as survivalists. They saw themselves as competent adults. The difference between then and now isn't technology. It's the systematic replacement of capability with consumption. You weren't born incompetent. You were sold that way. Pick one skill from this list. Just one. This week, try it. Make soap. Build a hay box. Harvest nettles. Start saving tomato seeds. Leave a comment below telling me which one you chose and what happened. That comment is worth more than you know, because every person who tries one of these things and reports back is proof that this knowledge isn't dead. It's just waiting.